Leonardo da Vinci. Part 1, The Apprentice, Florence, 1468–1476. I don't know what year it is where you're watching this from, but for me right now it's 1468. I am 16 years old, and I have just become someone else. My name is Leonardo. My father is a notary in Florence, a man of contracts and ink and other people's business, a man who spends his days making other men's promises legally binding. My mother is a peasant girl from a village called Vinci, a cluster of stone houses in the hills west of the city, which is where I got my name, because in this world, you carry the name of the place you came from when you have no family name of your own. I am illegitimate. That word will follow me my whole life. It will also, strangely, be the reason I'm free. My father married someone else the year after I was born, a woman of proper standing, the kind of match a notary is supposed to make. My mother married a kiln worker in the village. I was raised, for a time, in my father's house anyway, folded into a family that wasn't quite mine, watched over by a grandfather who seems to have liked me better than anyone else did. I remember him teaching me to notice things, the shape of a leaf, the way water finds the lowest point in a field without anyone telling it to. I didn't know yet that noticing would become the whole shape of my life. Legitimate sons in Florence become lawyers, or notaries like their fathers, or join the wool trade, or the silk guild, and inherit a whole system already built for them. Illegitimate sons become something else, because the university and the notarial guild are closed to us. And my father, for reasons I still don't fully understand, though I suspect it has something to do with the sheer volume of drawings I'd already filled by the time I was a boy, has decided that something else will be art. Today, he is walking me across the city, to the workshop of a man named Andrea del Verrocchio. I don't know, walking beside him through the narrow streets, that this single decision, made by a man who spent his life drafting other people's contracts, is about to become the hinge on which the rest of my existence turns. I only know that the streets smell of the Arno, of bread ovens, of the tannery quarter we cut wide around because the smell of curing leather is its own kind of violence. Florence in the morning is a city already at work. Shutters are opening. A woman above us empties a basin into the street and calls a warning half a second too late. The road to the workshop. We cross the Ponte Vecchio, which in these years is still lined with butchers and fishmongers rather than the goldsmiths who will replace them a century from now, and the smell changes with every few stalls. Blood, then brine, then wood smoke from a baker's oven built into the bridge's flank. My father doesn't speak much on this walk. I think he is nervous, though I don't understand yet that a father can be nervous on his son's behalf in a way that has nothing to do with affection and everything to do with reputation. He has a position to protect. Apprenticing a bastard son to a workshop is not scandalous. Exactly half of Florence's artists have complicated parentage, but it is a decision that will be discussed at dinners he is not invited to. We pass the baptistry, where I will, decades from now, be asked for designs I'll never build. I don't look at it long. At 16, a building is just a building unless someone tells you to look harder. Verrocchio's bottega sits near the church of Sant'Ambrogio, in a district thick with other workshops. A city within the city, really, because in Florence the trades cluster themselves by street the way ant colonies cluster by chamber. Painters near painters, wool near wool. My father knocks on a door I will walk through in one form or another, thousands of times over the next decade. The workshop. The bottega smells like linseed oil, hot metal and horse glue, the last of these boiled down from hide scraps and bones to make the ground for a panel. A smell so specific that I will recognize it, unbidden for the rest of my life, in doorways that have nothing to do with painting. There is a half-cast bronze horse's leg in the corner, taller than I am, propped against a wall as if it had simply walked in and stopped there mid-stride. Someone is grinding pigment with a stone wheel, the rhythm of it steady as a heartbeat. Someone else is arguing, not seriously, about the price of ultramarine, which is made from crushed lapis lazuli shipped from Afghanistan across half the known world. It costs more than gold, so painters use it sparingly, only for the most important blues in a painting. The Virgin Mary's robe, usually, because if you are going to spend a fortune on color, you spend it on the Mother of God and nowhere else. Verrocchio himself is not what I expected. I had pictured, I think, someone imperious, a man who paints because he has been anointed to. Instead, I find a broad-shouldered, restless-handed man who is not just a painter. He is a sculptor, a goldsmith, an engineer. He designs machinery, hoists, pulleys, mechanisms for moving stone and bronze that no one asked him to invent but that make his work possible. He studies anatomy by dissecting animals in a back room I am not shown on my first day, in order to understand how muscle moves under skin, how a tendon pulls a joint, why a horse's foreleg bends the way it does and not some other way. In this workshop, artist doesn't mean what it will come to mean centuries from now, a word for someone who makes beautiful things out of feeling. Here it means a person who understands how things work and can therefore make them beautiful. Beauty is not the opposite of mechanism. Beauty is what mechanism looks like once you understand it well enough to render it faithfully. This is the first thing that reshapes me. Painting is not decoration. Painting is applied knowledge. Verrocchio looks at the drawings my father has brought, studies I'd made at home, mostly of animals, mostly wrong in ways I don't yet have the vocabulary to name, and says very little. He asks me to draw something in front of him, a coil of rope on the table, nothing more. I remember the specific humiliation of realizing halfway through that I had been drawing what I believed a coil of rope looked like rather than the coil of rope actually in front of me. It is a small failure. It will turn out to be the failure that defines everything I do differently from other painters for the rest of my career, the discipline of drawing the thing itself, not the idea of the thing. I will spend years here not just holding a brush, but learning geometry, metallurgy, mechanics, the properties of light, grinding pigments before I'm allowed to touch a real panel. This is normal. Every apprentice starts as a servant of materials before he's trusted with meaning. My first month is spent almost entirely with a grinding stone and a muller turning lumps of raw color, malachite, red ochre, the cheaper blues made from azurite rather than lapis, into powder fine enough to suspend in egg yolk without grit. My arm aches in a new place every night. I am, in this period, essentially furniture that occasionally fetches things. The other apprentices. I am not alone in the workshop, and it takes me longer than I'd like to admit to understand the hierarchy I've stepped into. There is a boy a few years older than me, quick-tempered and quicker-handed, who everyone calls Botticelli after his brother's nickname, though his given name is Sandro. He has already left Verrocchio's direct supervision by the time I arrive, or is on his way out, having trained here before striking toward his own workshop, but his influence lingers in the way certain draperies are taught, a particular fondness for line over shadow that I will spend years arguing with silently in my own work. There is Pietro from Perugia, whom everyone will later call Perugino, meticulous and calm in a way that irritates me because I cannot tell if it is patience or simply the absence of curiosity. There is Lorenzo di Credi, close to my own age, who will become in time something like a friend, or at least the closest thing a workshop rivalry allows. We are both fast learners, both a little vain about it, and Verrocchio seems to enjoy setting us against each other on studies of the same subject, watching to see whose hand finds the truth of a fold of cloth first. The workshop is not a school in the way a modern person might imagine one. There are no lessons delivered from a podium. Knowledge moves sideways, through proximity. You learn how to prepare a gesso ground by watching someone else scrape one wrong and get shouted at. You learn the chemistry of drying oils by ruining a panel with too much linseed and watching it crack a season later. Failure in this workshop is not punished so much as absorbed into the record of things everyone now knows not to do again. I begin keeping notes of my own failures very early, though I don't yet understand that this habit, writing down what went wrong, and why precisely in enough detail to reconstruct it, will eventually become thousands of pages, the beginning of what people will one day call my notebooks, as if they were a single grand project rather than a compulsion I could not have stopped if I'd wanted to. A day in the workshop. Let me tell you what an ordinary day actually looks like, because the word apprentice conjures, for most people centuries from now, some vague image of a boy holding a palette while a genius paints, and that image is almost entirely wrong. The bottega opens before full light, because the best hours for fine work are the ones before the sun climbs high enough to throw harsh shadows through the workshop's north-facing windows. North light is prized precisely because it stays even through the day, without the swinging, dramatic shifts that direct sun brings. I am usually among the first to arrive, not out of virtue, but because I sleep poorly, and have found that walking the half-empty streets before the markets open settles something in me that lying awake does not. The first task of the day, most days, falls to whichever apprentice is lowest in the current pecking order, which for a long stretch of my early years means me, preparing the grounds. A panel destined for painting first needs a layer of gesso, a mixture of gypsum and animal glue, applied in thin coats, each one sanded smooth before the next goes on, sometimes 8 or 10 layers deep before the surface is judged ready to receive a drawing. This is not glamorous work. It is also, I come to believe, some of the most instructive work in the entire trade, because a poorly prepared ground will betray itself years later, cracking, absorbing pigment unevenly, refusing to hold a glaze the way it should, and no amount of skill in the painting above it can fix a foundation laid wrong underneath. I have never since been able to shake the conviction that this is true of most things, not only panels. By mid-morning, the workshop is at full noise, the grinding stones going, an argument in the corner about whether particular red has shifted color since it arrived from the merchant, Verrocchio's voice cutting through everything when he wants attention, which he rarely has to raise twice. Commissions in progress lean against every wall in various states: an altarpiece for a family chapel, a portrait bust in clay waiting to be cast, a small devotional panel for a private household too modest to commission from a more established name, and therefore willing to accept a Verrocchio workshop piece with an apprentice's greater hand in it than the patron probably realizes. Midday brings a meal, usually bread and whatever the workshop can afford that week, sometimes good, sometimes thin, eaten standing or sitting on stools pulled up around a low table, and this is often when the real education happens, because Verrocchio talks more freely with food in front of him than he does mid-task. This is where I first hear him explain, almost as an aside, how he calculates the proportions for the bronze horse he's been slowly assembling piece by piece, using ratios he learned not from another sculptor, but from a mathematician he consulted specifically because the scale of the piece, larger than any horse statue attempted in living memory, required calculations no one in the workshop trusted themselves to do by instinct alone. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that I wanted access to whatever that mathematician knew, and spending an unreasonable number of my meager wages over the following year on a tutor willing to teach an artisan's apprentice geometry that properly belonged, by social convention, to university men. The afternoon is usually given to whatever drawing or painting task has been assigned that week, interrupted by patrons visiting to check progress, by deliveries of materials, by the occasional argument that spills in from the street outside. Evenings, when there is enough daylight left and enough energy in my arms, I draw for myself, the studies that fill my private notebooks rather than anything a patron has asked for. A reputation begins, quietly. I want to describe, too, the strange, incremental way a reputation actually forms in a city like this, because it happens nothing like the sudden recognitions people centuries from now will imagine when they picture a genius being discovered. There is no single afternoon when Florence collectively decides I am talented. There is instead a slow accumulation of small, specific moments. A merchant mentioning, in passing conversation with another merchant, that Verrocchio has a young apprentice worth watching. A visiting patron, waiting for Verrocchio himself to finish some other business, glancing at a drawing left out on a table and asking, almost idly, who made it. A fellow painter from a rival workshop, seeing one of my studies through a mutual acquaintance, mentioning it to someone else with a specific kind of professional envy disguised as casual praise. None of these moments, individually, amounts to much. Together, over several years, they accumulate into something that begins to precede me into rooms I haven't yet entered. A patron arriving at the workshop already having heard, from some chain of conversation I'll never fully trace, that Verrocchio's talented young apprentice might be the one to actually execute the finer details of a commission, rather than merely assuming any capable hand in the workshop will do. I notice this shift mostly in small, practical ways, being asked more often to sit in on negotiations I would previously have been excluded from, being introduced by name rather than simply as one of my apprentices, patrons directing a question to me directly rather than through Verrocchio, expecting an answer I am, increasingly, actually qualified to give. I find I have complicated feelings about this slow accumulation, harder to sort through than simple pride would suggest. There is real satisfaction in being recognized for work I know I've earned through genuine, often tedious effort, the hours with the grinding stone, the disciplined study of dissected muscle, the unglamorous mathematics borrowed from a tutor I could barely afford. But there is also a specific discomfort in realizing that reputation, once it begins accumulating, takes on a life somewhat separate from the actual work that generated it, repeating itself through second-hand conversation, gaining small exaggerations with each retelling, until the version of me circulating through Florence's patron class bears only a loose resemblance to the actual apprentice standing at a workbench with grit still under his fingernails. I don't yet know how to feel about this gap between the person and the reputation, and I suspect, honestly, that I never fully will. The anatomy LESSONS. It's in these years that I first watch a dissection, though watch undersells how deliberately I sort it out. Verrocchio's interest in anatomy is practical and bounded. He wants to understand muscle and bone well enough to sculpt convincingly, and no further, but mine, from the very first session, refuses to stay bounded that way. The dissections available to a workshop in Florence in these years are mostly of animals, pigs, whose internal organs are close enough to humans to be instructive, and the occasional larger carcass when one becomes available through connections with a slaughterhouse or a sympathetic physician willing to look the other way about who's present in the room. Human dissection is rare, legally fraught, and considered by most of the city something between a medical necessity and a moral transgression, permitted only under specific and narrow circumstances, usually for university medical faculties rather than artists. I will not gain real access to human bodies until much later in my life, in circumstances I won't describe here because they belong to a different chapter of this story, but the habit of looking begins now, on animal carcasses in a cold back room that smells worse than anything else in the entire workshop combined. What strikes me immediately, cutting into a pig's foreleg with a knife I've sharpened myself because the workshop's other blades are all reserved for materials rather than flesh, is how little the muscles resemble the smooth, simplified shapes every painter I've studied uses to suggest them. A muscle is not a single, clean form. It is a bundle, fibrous, layered over other muscles, attached to bone by tendons that narrow and thicken in ways no drawing I've seen has bothered to render honestly. I begin sketching directly from the dissected limb. Labeling parts with names I invent on the spot because I don't yet know the proper terms. That vocabulary belongs to physicians. Written in Latin, I can read only imperfectly, and it will be years before I have the money and the connections to study it properly. This becomes, over time, one of the threads that separates my work from every other apprentice in the shop, including the more talented ones. When I paint an arm bent at the elbow, I am not copying a convention I learned from another painting. I am reconstructing, from memory of an actual dissected joint, what is actually happening beneath the skin, and letting the skin's surface reveal just enough of that truth to feel inevitable rather than invented. Verrocchio notices this, eventually, and it becomes one of the reasons he begins trusting me with more difficult figures rather than simply background elements. Studies of water. Separately from anatomy and just as consuming is my growing fascination with water, which begins, as far as I can trace it, with nothing more dramatic than watching the Arno from a bridge on an ordinary afternoon, and noticing that the water moving past a stone pier didn't move as a single sheet but broke into distinct, almost countable patterns, a smooth curve of current bending around the obstacle. Small spinning eddies peeling off where the smooth flow separated from the stone's downstream edge, foam gathering in specific pockets rather than spreading evenly across the surface. I begin returning to that same stretch of river at different hours, in different weather, trying to understand why the pattern changes with the water's speed, why a slow current curls gently around an obstacle while a fast one throws off violent, spinning turbulence, why foam collects where it does and not somewhere else. I have no mathematics yet capable of describing what I'm seeing. The language for that, the equations that would let a much later scientist name and predict this behavior precisely, doesn't exist yet and won't for centuries. So I do the only thing available to me, which is to draw it over and over from memory and from direct observation, filling pages with studies of spiraling water that most of my fellow apprentices find frankly bewildering. Since none of it will ever appear in a commissioned painting exactly as drawn. I begin, in this period, experimenting with small models to test my observations, dropping objects of different shapes into buckets and troughs of water, watching how the wake behaves differently behind a flat-fronted object than a pointed one, an observation that seems, at the time, like idle curiosity and that will, decades later, prove directly useful when I'm asked to consult on canal and irrigation projects that no one in this Florentine workshop could have predicted I'd ever be qualified to advise on. I don't yet understand in these years that this compulsion to understand water is not separate from my compulsion to understand muscle, or light, or the folds of wet cloth. They are the same question, asked of different materials. What is the underlying rule that produces this visible pattern, and can I draw it precisely enough that the drawing itself becomes a kind of proof? The materials of seeing. I become, over these early years, obsessed with the raw materials of the trade in a way that seems to unsettle the other apprentices, who treat pigment and panel and varnish as means to an end. I want to understand why. Why does verdigris, made by suspending copper plates over vinegar fumes, eventually eat through a panel if it isn't sealed properly? Why does egg tempera dry to a matte, forgiving surface while the newer oil techniques, which I've heard described with some suspicion as a northern innovation, something the Flemish painters do, allow for a translucency that tempera can never achieve, layer after layer of thinned pigment building up depth the way fog builds up over the Arno at dawn gradually, without a visible edge? Verrocchio is curious about this technique too, more than the older masters in the city, and it's through his workshop that I first begin experimenting with oil in earnest, mixing it myself, ruining several small panels before understanding how much time the medium needs, how it resists the impatience that tempera punishes but oil merely delays. I spend hours that no one has assigned me studying how light behaves on different surfaces, how it pools differently on wet stone than on dry cloth, how a candle flame throws a shadow with a soft, doubled edge that a window's daylight never does. I don't yet call this optics. I don't yet have a word for most of what I'm doing except curiosity, and curiosity, in a working bottega with commissions due and patrons waiting, is not always welcome. I am told, more than once in these years, to finish the panel in front of me before starting to wonder about the panel I haven't been asked to paint yet. Years of apprenticeship. Time moves strangely in a workshop. Days blur into the specific gravity of tasks, mixing egg tempera, stretching canvas over a wooden frame, copying drapery studies until my hand understands folds of cloth better than my mind does. There is a particular exercise Verrocchio assigns every apprentice, draping wet cloth over a small clay or wax model, and drawing the folds exactly as they fall, not as you imagine folds should fall, and I return to this exercise obsessively, long after I've technically mastered it, because I begin to notice that the folds obey rules, that cloth is not random, that it creases along lines determined by the shape underneath it and the direction of the pull. This is, I realize only much later, the first time I understood that beauty in nature is never arbitrary. It is always the visible outcome of an invisible cause. I begin to notice something about myself that the other apprentices don't seem to share, or at least don't seem to indulge the way I do. When I look at a bird in flight above the workshop roof, I don't just see a bird. I see the mechanism, how the wing catches air, how the joint at what would be the bird's wrist articulates to change the angle of the feathers mid-stroke, how the tail works as a rudder more than a display. When I look at water moving around a rock in the Arno, I don't just see a river. I see turbulence, pattern, a puzzle with rules I haven't been given the answer to yet. The way the water folds back on itself downstream of an obstacle, small eddies spinning off the main current in a shape, I will later spend actual decades trying to render accurately in ink, believing, correctly as it turns out, that if I could understand the mathematics of a whirlpool, I would understand something true about the world that painting alone could never teach me. I start filling pages with these observations, not just studies for paintings, studies of how things work, water, wings, muscles, the specific way an old man's neck folds compared to a young man's, so that if I am ever asked to paint age, I will not need to guess at it. My teachers will later call this a distraction from finishing commissions, and they are not wrong to be frustrated. There are panels that sit half-finished for longer than any patron should tolerate, because I have wandered off into some other question that seemed, at the time, more urgent than the deadline. I will spend my whole life being told my curiosity is a flaw in my discipline. I don't yet know how right, and how wrong, that criticism will turn out to be. Right, because it will cost me patrons, cost me finished works, leave behind a body of paintings embarrassingly small for a life this long. Wrong, because the curiosity is not separate from the discipline. It is the discipline. It simply doesn't recognize the boundaries other people draw around what a painter is for. The bronze horse. I mentioned the half-cast bronze horse leg, propped in the corner of the workshop on my very first day, and I should explain what it actually was, because it occupies more of my apprenticeship, in one form or another, than any single painting does. Verrocchio has been engaged, on and off across these years, in designing an equestrian monument, a mounted rider atop a rearing or striding horse, cast in bronze at a scale that terrifies every founder in the city who's asked to quote a price for the casting. The engineering problem is not trivial, and it consumes far more of the workshop's actual intellectual energy than any panel painting does. Bronze, poured molten into a mold this large, cools unevenly, and uneven cooling means cracking, means a monument that looks magnificent for a season and then fails silently from the inside, a hairline fracture spreading through metal no one can see once it's mounted in a public square. Verrocchio experiments with the internal armature, the skeleton of iron rods that will hold the clay model's shape and later guide the bronze, for longer than most patrons would tolerate, because he understands correctly that solving the structural problem now is cheaper than repairing a public monument that cracks apart 6 years after installation in front of the entire city. I spend real hours on this project that have nothing to do with painting at all, calculating, with the small mathematics I've scraped together from my borrowed tutoring, how the weight of a rearing horse's raised forelegs would need to be distributed through the rear legs and tail to keep the whole structure from toppling under its own bronze mass, a problem that has no obvious answer in any painting manual, and that I find, against all expectation, more absorbing than the painting commissions happening in the same room. This is, I think now, the clearest early evidence of something that will define the rest of my working life, that I have never been able to fully separate the making of beautiful things from the solving of structural problems, and that when forced to choose between finishing a commission on time and understanding why a structure holds together, I will, with troubling regularity, choose understanding. The left hand. I should say something plainly here, since it colors every page I've ever drawn and every page I'll draw after this one. I am left-handed, in a world that treats the left hand with open suspicion, the very word for it in Latin, sinister, carrying the weight of centuries of superstition about which side of the body belongs to virtue, and which to something less trustworthy. Verrocchio, to his considerable credit, never asks me to correct it, though I know of other workshops in the city where a left-handed apprentice would be forced to relearn his grip with his right hand out of simple prejudice. My left hand shapes my drawing in ways I notice more the longer I practice. Hatching, the fine parallel lines used to build shadow in a drawing, naturally falls, for a right-handed draftsman, in one diagonal direction, easiest to pull the pen or chalk toward the body rather than push it away. For me, the natural direction runs the opposite way, and anyone who studies my drawings carefully enough, in whatever century they're studying them, will be able to tell at a glance which hand made them, the way a detective might read a signature in the slant of a shadow. The mirror writing I mentioned earlier grows out of this same practical fact. Writing conventionally, left to right, with my left hand, drags the heel of my palm directly across ink that hasn't finished drying, smudging every line I've just written into the next. Writing right to left instead, my hand trails behind the pen rather than dragging across it, and the habit becomes so natural over these apprentice years that by the time I'm training myself, later in life, to also write conventionally when a document requires it for someone else to read easily, the mirrored version remains what my hand reaches for first, unbidden, whenever I'm writing only for myself. The NOTBOOKS begin. It's during these apprentice years that I begin, almost by accident, the habit that will outlast every commission I complete. I start carrying a small bound notebook, cheap paper, nothing fine, tucked into my belt, and I write in it constantly in whatever moment presents itself, waiting for a patron who is late, waiting for gesso to dry, waiting, always waiting, because a workshop apprentice spends an enormous portion of his life waiting on materials and other people's schedules. I write left to right sometimes, and more often as the habit solidifies, right to left, in a private mirror script that isn't really a code. Anyone patient enough could hold it to a glass and read it easily enough, but that suits my left hand, which moves more naturally in that direction and smudges less ink dragging across a page than it would writing conventionally. People will later make more of this mirror writing than it deserves, imagining secrecy where there was mostly just a left-handed man solving a practical smudging problem. The notebooks fill with everything at once, in no order I would defend if asked. A sketch of a pulley system for lifting the bronze horse leg in the corner, beside a diagram of a heron's neck, beside a list of words I want to remember, beside an unpaid debt I owe a color merchant, beside a study of how shadow falls across a draped arm. There is no separation in these pages between art and engineering and household accounting, because in my mind there isn't one. Everything is the same question asked in different materials. How does this actually work, and can I draw it precisely enough that someone else could see the answer too? The Angel. Around 1472, I am 20 now, Verrocchio is finishing a commission, a painting of Christ's baptism, for the monks of San Salvi, a large panel that has occupied a corner of the workshop for months in various states of near completion. Workshop paintings are often collaborative like this, in ways that would surprise anyone who imagines a Renaissance painting as the product of one man's solitary genius. The master designs and paints the important figures, Christ, the Baptist, the composition itself, and trusted apprentices fill in backgrounds, drapery, secondary elements, landscape, whatever the master judges beneath his own most valuable hours but still requiring real skill. Verrocchio assigns me one of the two angels kneeling at the edge of the scene, holding Christ's garment. I remember standing in front of the panel for a long time before I touched it, longer than was strictly useful, trying to decide what an angel should actually look like. Not the flat gold-haloed convention I'd copied 100 times in study, but a figure that could plausibly kneel on real ground, with real weight distributed through a real knee, wearing cloth that would fall the way cloth actually falls, rather than the way it's always been painted falling. I paint it in oil, a newer technique than the tempera Verrocchio trained in and still uses for most of the panel, one I've been experimenting with in private for over a year by this point, because it lets me build up translucent layers, soften edges, make light behave the way it actually behaves on skin, instead of the way tempera forces it to behave, all hard edges and flat, decisive color. I mix the flesh tones in thin glazes, building the angel's face slowly over what feels, at the time, like an unreasonable number of sessions, because I keep noticing something else to correct. The way light catches the inner curve of an eyelid, the faint shadow a strand of hair casts across a temple. I remember one particular evening, weeks into the work, staying at the panel long after the other apprentices had left, because I had finally understood something about the angel's hair that had been eluding me for days. That a single strand, catching the edge of light, does not simply turn lighter, it turns almost translucent, a faint gold at its very edge, distinct from the darker mass of hair behind it, and rendering that distinction required a glaze so thin I had to thin the oil itself further than I'd previously trusted the paint to hold together on the panel without running. I remember the specific satisfaction of watching that thin gold line dry the next morning exactly as I'd hoped, holding its shape, catching the workshop's north light the way I'd imagined it would the night before in near darkness, working by a single candle, because I hadn't wanted to lose the thought before morning. Verrocchio comes to look at the panel most days, sometimes saying nothing at all, sometimes correcting the angle of a fold or the placement of a shadow with 2 or 3 words and no explanation, trusting me to work out the reasoning myself rather than have it handed to me. A teaching method I resent slightly at the time, and am deeply grateful for later, because a correction you have to reason your way towards stays with you in a way that a correction simply handed over never does. On the days he says nothing, I've learned to read that as its own kind of verdict, a silence that could mean either satisfaction or a disappointment he hasn't yet found the patience to explain. There's a story that gets told about this moment, that Verrocchio saw my angel finished beside his own figures and set down his brush, and never painted again, so struck by the gap between what he could do and what his apprentice had just done. I can't tell you with certainty that it happened exactly that way. Stories about famous men tend to sharpen themselves over time, and this one has the suspicious shape of a legend built backward from my later reputation, the kind of story that gets told about a man once everyone already knows how his life ends. What I can tell you, because I was there and remember it more precisely than the legend allows, is that something shifts in the workshop after this painting. Verrocchio does not stop painting, he continues for years, but he begins giving me larger portions of commissions, begins consulting me on decisions rather than simply issuing them, begins introducing me to visitors not as an apprentice but with a kind of proprietary pride I find both flattering and faintly uncomfortable, as someone worth watching. I stop being treated only as a hand that executes someone else's vision. What I read. I should say something about learning itself, because it will surprise no one who knows how my life ends that I was, by the standards of educated Florentines, barely educated at all. I never attended university. My Latin, the language of every serious text on medicine, philosophy, and natural science available in this century, remains for years embarrassingly weak, something I try to correct later in life with a kind of grim, late-started discipline that never quite closes the gap. I am, by the polite and impolite words used by university men to describe someone like me, unlettered, a term that stings more than I let on, because it implies a mind not worth consulting, when what is actually true is narrower and more specific. I simply never had access to the texts, taught in a language I was never formally taught. What I have instead is the city itself, read like a text of its own. I talk to the mathematician my wages barely afford. I talk to physicians willing to indulge an artisan's questions about the body, usually for the price of a drawing they can use to illustrate their own private notes. I borrow books when I can, slowly working through translations, sometimes second-hand accounts of Latin texts rather than the originals, piecing together fragments of Euclid's geometry, of Archimedes' work on levers and floating bodies, of whatever Arabic optical theory has made its way into Italian through translation chains long enough that I sometimes wonder how much of the original argument survives the journey. This patchwork education leaves gaps that will embarrass me for the rest of my life, and also, I think, leaves me freer than the university-trained men around me, who have been taught not only what to think but the specific order in which one is permitted to think it. I come at problems sideways, without the proper training that would tell me a question is settled, or belongs to theology rather than natural philosophy, or has already been answered definitively by an ancient authority no one is supposed to contradict. I don't know enough to know I'm not allowed to ask certain questions, so I ask them anyway. The music of the city. There is a part of these years I haven't mentioned yet, because it has nothing directly to do with painting and everything to do with a habit of mind I'm only now, writing this account, recognizing as connected to everything else. I learned to play music, reasonably well, on an instrument I eventually helped design myself, a variation on the traditional lyre, shaped, if I'm honest, more like a horse's skull than any instrument a luthier would recognize as conventional, because I've become convinced that the shape of a resonating chamber changes its sound in ways no one has properly studied, and I want to test that conviction rather than simply take an existing design on faith. Florence in these years is full of music, sung poetry improvised in taverns, formal compositions performed at Medici gatherings I am not yet invited to but hear about through workshop gossip, church music that drifts out of open doors on feast days. I find I have a talent for improvising verse to a melody, a party trick more than a serious pursuit, but one that opens doors a painter's reputation alone wouldn't. I am invited, on occasion, to gatherings specifically because I can be relied on to entertain as well as observe, and I notice, even at the time, that this makes me useful to patrons in a way that has nothing to do with my actual skill with a brush. It is an early lesson in how patronage actually works. Talent matters, but so does being pleasant to have in a room, and a wise young man learns to be both. The merchants and the patrons. No painter survives on skill alone in this city, and part of my education, unglamorous but essential, is learning how commissions actually happen. A patron does not simply walk into a workshop and hand over money for a painting. There are negotiations, often lengthy, over price, over materials. A contract will frequently specify, in binding legal language not unlike the kind my father drafts for a living, exactly how much gold leaf is to be used and exactly how much genuine ultramarine, because patrons have been cheated before by workshops substituting cheaper azurite while charging for the costlier pigment, and a reputation for honest materials is worth almost as much as a reputation for skill. I watch Verrocchio negotiate these contracts more times than I can count, and I absorb, without ever being formally taught, the specific choreography of it. The patron names a figure lower than what he's willing to pay, the workshop names a figure higher than what it expects to receive, and both sides settle somewhere in the middle after a conversation that has almost nothing to do with the actual value of the work, and everything to do with a kind of ritual haggling neither party would dream of skipping, because skipping it would seem to suggest one side didn't respect the other enough to bargain properly. I begin to understand, too, that patrons want different things from a commission than the workshop assumes. A wealthy wool merchant commissioning an altarpiece for his family chapel wants, more than anything, to be remembered, his likeness, or his family's coat of arms, worked discreetly into a corner of a religious scene in a way that will outlast him by centuries, a form of immortality purchased the way another man might purchase land. A confraternity commissioning a public work wants visibility, a demonstration to the whole city of its piety and its resources. The Medici, when they commission anything, want something subtler still, a work that flatters them without appearing to be flattery, that suggests their rule is simply the natural, inevitable, almost invisible order of things rather than the product of ruthless political maneuvering, which of course it also is. The Medici Gardens. I mentioned that I have no direct contact with Lorenzo himself in these early years, and that remains mostly true, but there is one specific institution worth describing here, because it will matter more, much later, than I understand at the time. The garden near San Marco, where Lorenzo has begun assembling a collection of antique sculpture, fragments of Roman and Greek work, some excavated, some purchased from collectors and dealers across Italy, specifically so that promising young artists can study ancient form directly rather than through the imperfect copies and descriptions that have circulated for generations. I visit this garden more than once during these years, though I am never among the small circle of young men Lorenzo takes a direct personal interest in cultivating there. That distinction, as far as workshop gossip can determine, tends to fall to sculptors more than painters, and to young men whose family connections open doors that mine, illegitimate and provincial on my mother's side, simply don't. I feel this exclusion more than I let on. I stand in front of a fragment of a Roman torso, missing its arms and head, and understand, looking at the precision of the abdominal muscles carved by a sculptor working over 1,000 years before me, that the ancients had already solved problems of anatomical accuracy that my own century has mostly forgotten how to ask. This becomes, quietly, one of the engines of my later work, not reverence for antiquity exactly, but a kind of competitive irritation, a conviction that if a sculptor working over a millennium ago could render torso this precisely without any of the anatomical study I've been pursuing through dissection, then surely a modern painter, armed with direct observation of actual dissected muscle rather than inherited convention, ought to be able to do better still. What I leave unfinished. I should be honest about a pattern that begins in these apprentice years and will, I already suspect even now, follow me for the rest of my working life. I finish far less than I begin. There is a small devotional panel, commissioned separately from the workshop's larger projects by a merchant's widow who wanted something modest for her private chapel, that I accept as my own early commission, outside Verrocchio's direct supervision, a chance to prove I can manage a patron relationship on my own terms. I begin it with real enthusiasm, sketch the composition in a single sitting that feels, at the time, like the fastest and truest work I've ever done, and then I stall. The stalling isn't laziness, though I imagine it looks like laziness to the widow, who sends a servant twice to ask, with escalating politeness, when the panel might be ready. The stalling happens because I become fixated on a single technical problem, in this case, how to render the particular quality of light falling through a window onto the Virgin's hand, a problem that has nothing to do with finishing the commission and everything to do with a question I can't let go of once I've noticed it. I spend 2 weeks that should have gone toward completing the panel instead experimenting with glazes on a scrap board, trying to reproduce that specific fall of light, and by the time I return to the actual commission, The widow's patience has thinned considerably, and my own enthusiasm for the piece, oddly, has thinned along with it, as though the interesting problem had already been solved in my head during the scrapboard experiments, and the actual finishing of the panel had become, by comparison, tedious. I do eventually finish it, though later than promised, and with an apology that costs me more in humility than the commission was worth in money. I remember Verrocchio's reaction when he heard about the delay, not anger, which I might have found easier to absorb, but a kind of resigned recognition, as though he'd already seen this pattern coming and simply hadn't warned me, because some lessons only stick when they cost you something yourself. You will always know more than you finish, he tells me, not unkindly, and I don't understand yet how prophetic that sentence is going to turn out to be, how it will apply not just to this one delayed panel, but to entire decades of my working life, to commissions abandoned half complete, to a horse monument that will occupy years of my later life in Milan and never once be cast in bronze. To notebooks filled with plans for machines I will never build and inventions no patron will ever fund. Rivalry. I don't want to give the impression that the workshop is a place of uncomplicated brotherhood, because it isn't, and pretending otherwise would flatten something true about how ambitious young men actually treat each other when they're competing, whether they admit it or not, for the same limited attention from the same single master. Lorenzo Di Credi and I are, I think, genuinely fond of each other in these years, but fondness doesn't erase the small, specific irritations of constant comparison. When Verrocchio sets us both to studying the same drapery model, there is an unspoken but entirely real contest over whose version he'll praise first, and I notice, with an honesty I'm not always proud of, a small hot flash of satisfaction when mine is chosen, and an equally small, uglier flash of something like resentment when his is. We never speak of this directly. It would be considered, I think, a kind of admission neither of us wants to make, that the workshop's careful arrangement of equal apprentices working toward mastery together is underneath the surface a constant low-grade competition for a finite resource, which is Verrocchio's attention and eventually his recommendation to patrons who ask him which of his students they should trust with an independent commission. There is another apprentice, whose name I won't record here because I don't think it would be fair to him for a private grievance to outlive us both in ink, who makes his resentment of my growing reputation after the baptism panel considerably less subtle than Lorenzo ever does. He is, by every honest measure, a competent painter, solid and reliable in exactly the ways a workshop needs someone to be solid and reliable, and I think he understands correctly that solid and reliable will never be praised the way the angel was praised, and that this isn't fair exactly, even if it's true. I don't know what to do with his resentment, except absorb it quietly and try, not always successfully, not to let it curdle into arrogance on my own part, since arrogance is a trap that has swallowed better painters than either of us. A garden, a lectern, an angel again. Somewhere in these same years, close enough to the baptism commission that I sometimes confuse the order of events when I try to reconstruct them honestly, I take on a small panel of my own, an Annunciation, the angel Gabriel kneeling before the Virgin in a garden, a subject painted so many thousands of times by so many workshops across the city that a patron might reasonably assume there is nothing left to discover in it. I don't share that assumption, and I suspect this is precisely why the panel takes me longer, and troubles me more, than a subject this familiar has any right to. The problem I fixate on this time is the garden itself, specifically, the precise botanical accuracy of the flowers and grass at the Virgin's feet, which most workshops render as a generalized, decorative pattern of greenery, pleasant but botanically meaningless, the kind of foliage that could be anything or nothing. I decide, for reasons I can only half explain even to myself, that if I am painting a specific garden I ought to paint specific plants, rendered accurately enough that a botanist could name them, and I spend an embarrassing number of afternoons in an actual garden near the workshop, sketching individual blades of grass and the particular structure of a lily's petals, structure that turns out to be far more mathematically regular than casual observation would suggest. Each petal's curve following a pattern I don't yet have language to describe as anything other than correct in a way I can feel before I can prove. I also spend considerable time on the lectern in front of the Virgin, an elaborately carved stand holding an open book, because I want the perspective of its carved supports to be genuinely, geometrically correct rather than merely plausible looking, and I work out the vanishing point with a rigor that, I later learn, exceeds what most viewers would ever consciously notice. Though I've come to believe that viewers feel correct perspective, even when they can't name why a painting feels stable and trustworthy rather than subtly wrong. The wings I give the angel trouble me longest of all. I want them to look like they could actually belong to a creature capable of flight, structured with the same logic I've been applying to my studies of actual birds, rather than the decorative, vaguely feathered suggestions of wings that most painters use as a kind of visual shorthand for angel, without any interest in whether the wing, as drawn, could plausibly generate lift. I study a bird of prey's wing, borrowed briefly, feather by feather, from a falconer who keeps birds for the hunt, and is bemused but not unwilling to let a young painter examine one closely, and I build Gabriel's wings from that structure, scaled up, feathers layered the way actual flight feathers layer rather than however seems decoratively pleasing. When the panel is finally finished, later than I'd promised whoever commissioned it, I remember standing back from it in a moment of genuine, private satisfaction that I don't often allow myself, because I know, looking at it, that no other workshop in the city would have spent this much unpaid attention on grass and lectern joints and the structural logic of a fictional creature's wings. I don't know yet whether this instinct, to chase precision far past the point any patron would notice or pay for, will serve me or ruin me over the course of a whole career. I suspect, even now, that the honest answer will turn out to be both. The Guild. That same year, 1472, I am formally registered in the Compagnia di San Luca, the Painters' Guild of Florence, an organization that regulates who may legally accept commissions in the city, sets standards for materials, and functions as something between a trade union and a religious confraternity, since it takes its name from St. Luke, patron of painters. It's a bureaucratic moment, not a dramatic one. A name in a ledger, a small fee paid, a formality that takes less time than the walk to the Guildhall and back, but it means something specific. I am no longer only an apprentice bound to another man's workshop by custom rather than law. I am now, by the standards of my city, permitted to be considered a master in my own right, entitled to take my own commissions, train my own apprentices, sign my own name to a panel without anyone's supervision required. I choose to remain in Verrocchio's workshop a while longer anyway, because there is still more to learn than there is reason to leave, and because the workshop offers a steady stream of commissions and materials that an independent master starting from nothing would have to build for himself slowly, without patrons yet. Also, if I am honest with myself in these pages meant for no one, I am not entirely certain yet what kind of master I want to be, and the workshop lets me postpone that decision a little longer under the comfortable excuse of loyalty. My father's house. I don't see my father as often as the walk between his house and the workshop would suggest I could. This isn't estrangement exactly. He continues to take an interest in my progress, continues, I learn much later, to quietly mention my name to acquaintances who might one day become useful patrons, the kind of low-effort networking a notary does instinctively, because his entire profession runs on knowing who owes what to whom. But there is a formality between us that never quite dissolves, a sense that I am in his house, a slightly complicated fact to be managed rather than simply a son to be enjoyed. He has, by this point, remarried more than once. His first wife, the legitimate match he made the year after my birth, has died without giving him a legitimate son, and he marries again, and eventually will have a large number of half-siblings for me, born so much later in his life that some of them are closer in age to my own future apprentices than to me. I feel toward these half-siblings, in these early years, mostly a distant curiosity rather than anything warmer, since most of them are still infants or not yet born, and it will be decades before their existence becomes a genuine complication in my life, when questions of inheritance arise after our father's death, and I discover exactly how little the law is inclined to consider an illegitimate son's claim, whatever affection or reputation I've accumulated by then. My mother I see even less, though not for lack of feeling. She remains in the countryside, married to her kiln worker, living a life so distant from the workshop's world of pigment and patronage that when I do visit, rarely, I find myself oddly unable to describe what I actually do all day in terms that would mean anything to her. I remember one visit in these years where I tried to explain the bronze horse project, the mathematics of weight distribution through a rearing animal's hind legs, and watched her polite incomprehension harden slowly into simple pride that had nothing to do with understanding the specifics and everything to do with the fact that her son, born to no name and no prospects, was somehow being trusted with a project important enough to require mathematics at all. The city of the Medici. Florence itself in these years is not a quiet place to come of age. It is ruled, unofficially, but completely, without any of the formal titles a king or duke would carry, by the Medici family, bankers who have converted commercial wealth into political control, so thoroughly that the city's republican institutions, its councils and elected officials, have become something closer to theatre performed around a decision already made elsewhere. Lorenzo, the grandson of the elder Cosimo, is not yet called the Magnificent by everyone. That title accretes slowly, earned through the specific combination of ruthlessness and cultivated taste that will define his rule, but he is already, in these years, consolidating power through patronage as much as politics. funding artists, philosophers, poets, buying manuscripts of rediscovered Greek texts, turning the city into something like a competition for whose court is more dazzling, where the currency that matters as much as gold florins is the appearance of taste. This is the water I am swimming in, though I don't yet have any direct contact with Lorenzo himself. That will come later, and even then in ways more complicated and more disappointing than a young apprentice might hope. What I absorb instead, second-hand, through the workshop's gossip and the commissions that pass through it, is the texture of a city where talent is not just admired but weighed, priced, and traded as deliberately as wool or silk. A painter's reputation moves through Florence the way a rumor moves, quickly, unevenly, gaining detail with every retelling. And I understand early that the difference between an obscure workshop hand and a master, whose name opens doors, has less to do with raw ability than with which patron notices you first and how loudly they say so afterward. I spend what free hours I have wandering the city rather than resting, which I suspect worries my father more than it should. I watch the sculptors working in the Duomo workshop on ornaments for the cathedral that has, by this point, stood topped by Brunelleschi's dome for decades, but still isn't fully finished in its details. I listen to preachers in the piazza arguing points of theology I only half follow. I watch the wool merchants haggle in a dialect thick enough that I sometimes have to reconstruct the meaning from tone alone. Florence teaches me in these years that a city is itself a kind of mechanism, money moving through it, the way blood moves through a body, patronage flowing from the wealthy down through workshops down through apprentices, like capillaries carrying something essential to the smallest, farthest tissue. I don't write this comparison down yet. It will occur to me decades later, in a different city, studying an actual dissected heart, that I had been circling this idea about Florence since I was 20. Hardship in the city. Florence in these years is not only patronage and pageantry, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that a workshop apprentice's life floats entirely above the ordinary difficulties of the city around him. There are years of poor harvest in the countryside that push grain prices high enough that even a working household like the one I board in feels the pinch, bread thinner and coarser than usual, meat rarer at the midday meal. There is, more than once in this period, illness moving through the crowded parishes near the workshop, not the plague itself, not in these particular years, though the memory of it, and the fear of its return, sits close under the surface of everyone older than me, who remember outbreaks vivid enough that certain streets are still spoken of as places where whole households were lost within a season. I remember one particular autumn when a fever moves through the district, not plague exactly but serious enough that 2 apprentices from a neighboring workshop die within the same week, young men I knew only well enough to nod to in the street, and the whole quarter takes on a hushed, careful quality for a month afterward, doors closed earlier than usual, fewer people lingering in the piazza past dusk. Verrocchio, uncharacteristically, insists we all go home to our own households rather than sleep in the workshop, as some apprentices without other lodging sometimes do, a small precaution that probably does nothing against a fever whose actual cause none of us understand, but that comforts him, I think, more than it protects us. These are the years, too, when I begin noticing how unevenly the city's wealth actually distributes itself, a fact so obvious to anyone paying attention that I feel almost foolish writing it down, except that a boy raised comfortably in a notary's house doesn't always notice what's directly in front of him until he starts walking the poorer parishes on his own errands. The wool workers who card and comb the raw fleece before it ever reaches a weaver live in conditions considerably harder than anything my own apprenticeship demands, paid by the piece rather than the day, vulnerable to every fluctuation in the wool trade in a way that makes the workshop's occasional lean month look, by comparison, like genuine security. I don't yet turn this observation into any coherent political conviction. That isn't really my temperament, then or later. Politics interests me mainly as a mechanism to be understood rather than a cause to be championed, but it stays with me as one more example of the city functioning as a system with visible winners and quieter losers. Patronage flowing generously toward a small circle of talent, while the much larger circle of ordinary labor that makes the whole apparatus possible receives comparatively little of the credit or the coin. A shadow. Not everything in these years is triumph, and I would be dishonest with you, whatever year you are watching this from, if I skipped past the parts that frightened me. In April of 1476, an anonymous accusation is filed against me and 3 other young men, alleging misconduct with a 17-year-old named Jacopo Saltarelli, who works, among other things, as a model for several workshops in the city, including on occasion my own. Florence has a system for this kind of accusation, a locked wooden box called the tamburo, mounted at various points in the city, where any citizen can drop an anonymous note accusing another of a crime, without ever needing to give their name or stand behind the claim. It is, even by the standards of a city I otherwise admire. A mechanism built for exactly the kind of unaccountable damage it does to me in these weeks. The charges are investigated by the Office of the Night, the magistracy created specifically to police this category of offence, and after a period of genuine fear that I do not exaggerate when I describe it that way, they are dismissed, for lack of evidence, dismissed twice, in fact, as the case is reopened once and dropped again a few months later. I am told, though never in any way I could prove, that one of the other accused young men has family connections to the Medici, and that this connection likely does more to protect all four of us than any actual innocence the magistrates might have weighed on its own merits. This is perhaps the ugliest lesson Florence teaches me in these years, that justice in this city, as in most cities I will come to know, runs partly on evidence and partly on whose name sits near yours on the docket. I don't dwell on this out loud in this life, and I suspect I never will, in any of the notebooks I keep or any conversation anyone manages to have with me about it later. But it teaches me something I carry forward for the rest of my days. That reputation in this city can be shaped by a hand you never see and will never be permitted to answer, and that survival, for someone like me, sometimes means becoming difficult to pin down, publicly guarded, privately unknowable, generous with my curiosity about the mechanics of the world, and almost entirely silent about the mechanics of my own interior life. Historians centuries from now will still be arguing about what this moment meant, about who I loved and how, piecing together fragments of court records and second-hand testimony long after I am not here to correct them. I'm not going to resolve that argument for them. I've decided, sometime in the weeks after the second dismissal, that some rooms in a life are allowed to stay closed, even from a notebook that otherwise holds everything. What I will say, because it seems true and useful rather than merely private, is that the months of that accusation changed the way I move through the city. I become more careful, not less curious. The two are not the same thing, whatever the moralists would prefer. I begin dressing more particularly, indulging a taste for fine, brightly colored clothing that some in the workshop find vain and I find, privately, to be a kind of armor. If a man is going to be looked at regardless, he might as well decide the terms on which he's seen. There is a specific quality to the weeks between the first accusation and its dismissal that I don't think I've ever adequately described to anyone, even in the privacy of a notebook otherwise willing to hold almost anything. It is not quite fear in the ordinary sense. I am not, at any point, certain I will be seriously punished, since the case against all four of us is thin enough that even the magistrates seem to be moving through a formality rather than pursuing a genuine conviction. It is something closer to a sustained, low awareness that my life has become, without my consent, a subject other people are permitted to discuss, weigh, and judge in rooms I am not invited into, based on evidence I will never fully see in accusations whose author I will never learn. I find myself in these weeks unusually quiet in the workshop, offering fewer of my usual observations at the midday meal, watching Verrocchio's face for any sign that the accusation has changed how he sees me, though if it has, he never once lets it show, and I am grateful to him for that in a way I don't think I ever properly said aloud. When the case is dismissed the second time, in the summer, there is no dramatic relief, no single moment of exhale. It simply stops being mentioned, the way a fever stops being the subject of conversation once it's clearly broken, replaced by an unspoken understanding among everyone who knew about it that the matter is now considered closed permanently, by mutual and slightly uncomfortable agreement. I go back to work. I finish a panel that had been sitting half abandoned during the worst of it. I tell myself, and mostly believe, that nothing essential has changed. But something has quietly, and it takes me longer than these months to fully understand what. I begin to notice, more consciously than before, how carefully I choose what goes into the notebooks and what stays only in my head. There is a category of thought, I realize, that I have started keeping entirely private, not because I'm ashamed of it, though the city has certainly tried to teach me shame, but because I no longer trust that private things stay private in a city with a locked box on a public wall inviting anonymous accusation. This is, I think, the real cost of that spring, not the fear itself which passed, but the permanent, low-grade calculation I now perform, almost without noticing, about which parts of a life are safe to record and which are not. A conversation about ambition. There is one conversation with Verrocchio from these years that I return to often enough in memory that I want to set it down here as precisely as I can reconstruct it, though I know memory sharpens dialogue over time the same way legends sharpen anecdotes about famous men. It happens late, after most of the workshop has gone home, the two of us finishing some minor task by lamplight. I want to say it was cleaning brushes, though it may have been something else entirely. The specific chore has faded while the words around it haven't. I ask him, with the particular bluntness a young man allows himself only with someone he trusts completely, whether he ever regrets the time his own curiosity, the machinery, the anatomy, the endless mathematical fussing over the bronze horse's proportions, steals from the paintings that actually pay the workshop's bills. I expect, I think, a simple yes, some world-weary confirmation that ambition beyond commissioned work is a young man's indulgence to be outgrown. Instead, he's quiet for long enough that I think he might not answer at all, and then he tells me something like this: that a workshop can teach a man to paint competently in a few years, reliably enough to earn a living for the rest of his life, and that most painters, once they've reached that competence, stop learning anything essentially new, repeating the same solved problems in slightly different arrangements for every subsequent commission, because repetition is safe and curiosity is not. He tells me that the horse has cost him money he'll likely never fully recover, patrons he's kept waiting longer than any patron should tolerate, and that he would make the same choice again without hesitation, because he would rather be remembered, if he's remembered at all, for the one true thing he tried to build, than for a lifetime of safely repeated competence. I don't fully understand, at the time, how much of this conversation is really about me rather than about him. A teacher's oblique way of giving a talented, restless apprentice permission to be exactly as restless as his curiosity demands, without ever directly telling him so, because direct instruction of that kind isn't really something either of us has language for yet. I understand it much better in hindsight, decades later, turning this same conversation over in my memory during years when my own unfinished projects have cost me exactly the kind of patron goodwill Verrocchio described losing over the horse. I think of this conversation, more than once, as a kind of inheritance, quieter and more valuable than any technique he ever taught me with a brush. Permission, given sideways, late at night, over some forgotten chore, to spend a life chasing questions no one commissioned. The first stirrings of Leaving. By the later years of this account, I've begun quietly to imagine a workshop of my own, though I haven't said this aloud to Verrocchio and don't intend to for some while yet. It isn't restlessness with him specifically. I owe him more than I've probably ever properly expressed, and I suspect I'll go on learning from proximity to him even after I've technically left his direct instruction, the way you go on hearing a teacher's voice correcting you long after the actual lessons have ended. It's something more specific, a growing sense that the kinds of problems I most want to pursue, the mechanics of flight, the mathematics of turbulence, the precise architecture of the human body, sit slightly outside what a busy commercial workshop, however generous, can afford to spend its apprentices' hours on. A workshop survives on finished commissions delivered on time. I am, by now, honestly aware of my own tendency to wander from a finished commission toward an unfinished question, and I understand that this tendency will eventually need either more patience from a patron than most patrons have, or a different kind of arrangement entirely, a patron willing to fund curiosity itself rather than only its occasional finished products. I don't yet know that this arrangement exists, more or less, in a court far to the north, in a city ruled not by bankers dressed as republicans, but by a duke who understands, in a way Florence's mercantile patrons mostly don't, that an engineer capable of designing both a fortification and a festival decoration is worth retaining on salary rather than commissioning piece by piece. I don't know that I'll write, within a few years of where this account ends, a letter to that duke's court describing myself primarily as a builder of war machines and bridges, almost apologetically appending, near the very end of a long list of military and engineering capabilities, that I can also, when required, paint as well as any man alive. I don't know any of that yet. I only know that Florence, for all it has given me, feels, by these final apprentice years, like a room I've mapped completely enough to start wondering what's through the door. Verrocchio himself, I think, senses this before I've said anything, the way a good teacher often senses a student's coming departure before the student has admitted it even to himself. He begins, in these final years I'm describing, giving me more independence within the workshop's projects, letting me take fuller responsibility for entire commissions rather than single figures within someone else's composition, letting me negotiate directly with certain patrons rather than always standing behind his own name. I understand this now as a kind of preparation, deliberate on his part even if never explicitly stated. He is teaching me, in these last apprentice years, not just how to paint but how to run a workshop of my own, because he knows, better than I do yet, that I will eventually need to. Where this leaves me. By the end of these years, I am in my early 20s. I have a guild registration that lets me sign my own name to my own commissions, whenever I choose to seek them. I have a growing reputation, still mostly confined to Florence, still mostly measured in whispers about the angel in Verrocchio's baptism panel rather than in commissions of my own. I have notebooks filling with studies no one asked me to make: water, wings, muscle, the mathematics of a whirlpool, the folds of wet cloth over a wax model, the exact angle at which candlelight throws a doubled shadow, and a restlessness I don't yet have a name for, though I suspect, even now, that it will never entirely resolve into anything as simple as satisfaction. I don't know yet that I'll leave Florence for Milan within a few years, driven as much by the city's crowded field of established masters as by any grand ambition, arriving at the Sforza court with a letter that describes my talents mostly in terms of military engineering and only mentions, almost as an afterthought, that I also paint a little. I don't know about the Last Supper, decaying almost from the moment I finish it because I insisted on experimenting with a technique better suited to walls than the fresco method that would have preserved it, or the Mona Lisa, a portrait I will carry with me, unfinished by my own standards, for the rest of my life, or the flying machines that will never leave the ground in my lifetime but will still be studied, argued over, half-believed 500 years from now. Or the anatomical drawings I have not yet begun, made from bodies I have not yet been permitted to open, that will turn out to be more accurate than anything published in a medical text for another 2 centuries. Right now, in this workshop that still smells of linseed oil and horse glue, with a locked box somewhere in the city that recently held my name inside an accusation I'll never fully put down, I try to take stock of what these years have actually given me, separate from whatever legend later centuries decide to build around them. I have a trained hand, capable of things it could not do when I first walked through this door at 16, capable of rendering a fold of cloth, a strand of hair catching light, a muscle bending beneath skin, with a precision that owes as much to a pig's dissected foreleg as to any painting I ever copied. I have a habit of private observation that has, by now, entirely outgrown its usefulness to painting alone, filling notebooks with studies of water and flight and anatomy that no patron has asked for, and that I suspect, even now, I will never fully stop pursuing, whatever else my working life eventually demands of me. I have a guild registration that lets me call myself a master, though I don't yet feel much like one, and a reputation, still small, still mostly confined to this one city, built on a single painted angel and a story about a teacher setting down his brush that may or may not have happened exactly the way it's already being told. I have, too, a wariness I didn't have at 16, the specific low-grade caution of a man who has learned that a locked box on a public wall can hold his name without his knowledge, that reputation in this city is shaped as much by unseen hands as by visible talent, and that some rooms of a life are safer kept closed, even from the notebook that otherwise holds almost everything else I notice. I don't think this wariness has made me smaller. I think, if anything, it has taught me the specific value of the pages that remain entirely mine, the studies of turbulent water, the sketches of a bird's wing joint, the diagrams of a horse's weight distributed through its hind legs, because these, unlike a reputation, cannot be taken from me by an anonymous accusation or a shifting patron's favor. They are simply true, or they are not, independent of who is watching. I don't know yet that I'll leave Florence for Milan within a few years, driven as much by the city's crowded field of established masters as by any grand ambition, arriving at the Sforza court with a letter that describes my talents mostly in terms of military engineering and only mentions, almost as an afterthought, that I also paint a little. I don't know about the Last Supper, decaying almost from the moment I finish it because I insisted on experimenting with a technique better suited to walls than the fresco method that would have preserved it, or the Mona Lisa, a portrait I will carry with me, unfinished by my own standards, for the rest of my life, or the flying machines that will never leave the ground in my lifetime but will still be studied, argued over, half-believed 500 years from now. Or the anatomical drawings I have not yet begun, made from bodies I have not yet been permitted to open, that will turn out to be more accurate than anything published in a medical text for another 2 centuries. I don't know either how many of the projects that will consume entire years of my later life will end unfinished, the way that small devotional panel nearly did, the way the bronze horse in Milan eventually will, cast not in metal but only ever in clay, melted down for cannon before a single mold could be poured, a monument that existed, in the end, more completely on paper than it ever did in the world. I suspect, even now at the close of this account, that this will be the shape of my whole life, more questions asked than answered, more studies begun than finished, a body of completed work embarrassingly small next to the sheer volume of pages I will fill trying to understand, precisely and for no patron's benefit, how the world in front of me actually works. Right now, in this workshop that still smells of linseed oil and horse glue, I only know one thing clearly, and it is enough for tonight to close on. I was given a trade. I am about to turn it into something no one asked for. End of Part 1. Part 2, Milan, the Sforza court, and the beginning of the notebooks in earnest, follows separately.